A friend called me recently, and he was upset, frustrated, even a little angry, because a couple days before, he'd been in a meeting, he'd lost his cool. He'd yelled at somebody across the room at the meeting, very unprofessional, inappropriate. And the next morning, he got a call from the leaders of that organization who had happened to be at that meeting, letting him know just how unacceptable his behavior had been. And my friend was calling me because he said, and this is exactly what he said. He said, I don't understand. I'm human. I make mistakes. I don't understand why I'm not getting more grace from people in this situation. Just 7 days later, I'm reading this devotional booklet that was written by my lifelong friend, Dwayne Grady, who grew up down the gravel road from me. He's a recently retired minister, and every couple of years, the denomination that we grew up in, he and I call him and ask him to write a quarterly devotional. And when he writes them, I read them. He's a smart dude. He's a good writer and stimulating. And just in one of these passages that I was reading, just in passing, he mentioned a theologian named Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his ideas about grace. Now, I don't usually just sit around thinking about grace, but at this point in my life, I really don't believe in coincidences either. So when you get these two things from two friends hitting me from two different angles on grace, I took that as a message from the larger universe that this is something I needed to spend a little more time thinking about. So that's what I hope to do this morning, is to share a few thoughts with you about grace, maybe a little bit about my own personal journey with the topic, and then hopefully we'll have a little time at the end. You can share any reactions you might have, and a minute or two to share a brief thought about grace if you have them. You know, grace is one of those typically weird, actually, English words that has multiple meanings. You know, I think most of us probably first exposed to it as a prayer. I know on the farm, before we had supper every night, we'd say grace, just a simple prayer of thanksgiving. Then there's that type of grace where people say, oh, they handled that situation with such grace, or they move with such grace. Yeah. Nobody's ever accused me of doing either one of those things. So I really don't know for sure what it means, but I think it means just being able to hand things in a calm, cool, steady manner where you rise above the fray. But the grace I hope we can talk about this morning is I've always defined as love and forgiveness just wrapped all up into one and just given freely to somebody. No strings attached. At least that's what I thought we were going to talk about this morning. But then I actually started asking people, what does grace mean to you? And much to my surprise, every single person I asked gave me a different answer. One person said when they receive grace, they feel like they're getting the benefit of the doubt. Another person said, grace is undeserved love, with the emphasis on undeserved. Yet another person told me when they received grace, they said, I feel like it's a ticket to freedom. Ticket to freedom? I said, what? Freedom from what? They said freedom from guilt, freedom from shame. Ticket to freedom. All these different definitions kind of threw me. I wasn't expecting it at all. I didn't really quite know what to make of it, but I figured it kind of forced me to look at grace from a little different angle. And I began to wonder if grace isn't really just a feeling. Because the only commonality that I could figure out between all the definitions everybody told me was that it made the receiving person feel a sense of calm, a sense of that they're okay as they are, a sense of internal peace or tranquility in some way. And it kind of kicked in and made me think of that maybe grace, being so hard to define, is sort of like how a U.S. Supreme Court justice some time ago defined, oddly enough, pornography when he said, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And I wonder if grace isn't a little bit like that. You know, we have a heck of a time trying to define it, but we know it when we feel it. We know it when we feel it. And it makes me wonder what each of you, what grace means to each of you. Now, my own journey with grace has been a complicated one, starting when I was just a little tyke in second grade, when I could actually start to read the words of the hymnals. And in the hymnals, the songs that we were singing. And the first time I read that verse in the song Amazing Grace, where, and you're familiar with the song, and the verse where it talks about God saving a wretch like me. And when I first read that line, I was very confused. Because just 2 years earlier, when I was in kindergarten Sunday school, the first thing I ever learned was that I was a child of God. So was everybody else in the class. So was everybody in the church. So was everybody in the whole world. We're all children of God. And even as a second grader, I'm thinking, if I'm a child of God, how am I a wretch? You know, it really didn't make sense to me then, and it really doesn't. It doesn't make sense to me now. And I know the song Amazing Grace is meaningful to some of you, to many people, and it does have a powerful backstory to the author and everything, but for several reasons, it's not my cup of tea. And that brings me to a very specific request I have of all of you here today. I don't think Mike Knapp is here today. He's often up in the balcony, but he's actually flying, I think, back to Waterloo, member of our congregation, for those of you who don't know him. And my request of all of you is that you not allow Mike to play the song Amazing Grace on his bagpipes at my funeral. I've heard it once. I don't need to hear it again. And if he tries to play it at my funeral, I would like you to physically intervene to prevent it from happening. And if he does play it, I promise I will come back and haunt him. I will haunt him. Now, so as much as I don't like the song Amazing Grace, hey, I got to admit, I like being on the receiving end of grace as much as anybody. I mean, it feels good. It comes at you. It feels warm. Makes you feel good about yourself. There's no expectations, no strings attached, no quid pro quo. What's not to like? Right? There's a quote from a guy named G.K. Chesterton. It's kind of funny. Well, it's not really funny, but I think it's kind of on point. And he says, children are innocent and love justice. Most of us are wicked and naturally prefer mercy. And I obviously don't agree with the most of us are wicked part, but pretty sure ain't none of us going to turn around and run away the other direction if we see grace or mercy coming at us. Can I get an amen on that, Molly? So we're the other thing that struck me about the thing that concerns me about grace is I wonder if one of the reasons we don't like it so much and it feels so good to us is because it asks so little of us. This was driven home to me just the other day. I'm driving down Kimball Avenue from my home into Waterloo. And there on a church, a big electronic sign in the churchyard, a simple phrase in bright neon letters, all caps with an exclamation point. Grace costs you nothing. Grace costs you nothing. And I thought, what a perfect modern definition of our understanding of grace. It's easy. It comes to us easy. It's free. It's cheap. It's cheap. Which brings us back around to the theologian that I mentioned earlier, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, fairly influential theologian in Germany in the early 1900s, and he coined the term cheap grace. And what he meant by that was when we receive grace and expect grace, but we do it on our own terms. In the Christian language world that he moved in at the time, he might say that an example of cheap grace would be preaching forgiveness without redemption, or maybe baptism without any type of accompanying discipline, or maybe communion without confession. You kind of get the feel of what he's saying here. He's saying I think in modern UU language, he might say that cheap grace is expecting or anticipating grace without accountability. Or simpler terms, getting something for nothing. Right? And you may say, well, this is all just theological gobbledygook and doesn't really impact our daily lives or anything. No. Remember my friend who called me that I told you about at the beginning? He called and he literally said he was expecting grace. He said, why am I not receiving grace? He even felt he was deserving of grace, even though at that point he hadn't even admitted to himself, let alone anyone else, that he had actually even done anything wrong or made a mistake. So yeah, cheap, he wanted grace. He was looking for grace. Cheap grace. Cheap grace without any accountability. Now, when I first was exposed to this idea of cheap grace, it really hit me like a sometimes you hear things and they just hit you and you're like, yeah, there's a lot of truth in that. And when I heard this cheap grace, I was like, yeah, there's a lot of truth in this. But at the same time, it brought up this attention. Because on one hand, I love, like everybody else, to receive grace. But on the other hand, I had this instinctive reaction against it. I couldn't figure out why. And I had to kind of do some thinking about it. And I think I figured it out eventually. But I had to go all the way back to 9th grade. And because that was when, I don't know who, how, or why, but I was exposed to the writings of Karl Marx. And in fact, there was a friend of mine in the band in 9th grade who used to carry around this little red book of Mao Zedong's quotations. Some of you may be old enough to remember this. 2 billion copies of this were printed in China in the 1960s. Not million, billion. And if you wanted to survive in China in the 1960s, you better have one of these on your person to demonstrate your loyalty to the nation and to Mao Zedong. Now, most of the stuff I read from Marx in junior high, way over my head, right? And if I were to dive back into it today, most of it probably go right over my head. Because, we get into it, it's complicated stuff. But there were a couple concepts and values that really have shaped me from those readings. And one of them is the value and the belief that self-critique is the key to growth and progress. Now, when I say self-critique, I'm not talking about the criticisms that we level at ourselves out of insecurities. Like, I'm not tall enough, I'm not handsome enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm not thin enough, I'm not pretty enough. No. Self-critique I'm talking about is simply the ability, having the self-awareness to identify our shortcomings, create a plan to shore up those shortcomings, and then execute the plan. simple. It works for individuals, congregations, nations, and I think it could work for the world. One thing it's not is perfectionism, which Reverend Smith did a pretty good number on here in our pulpit last week. It's not, well, I'm of the I'm okay, you're okay generation. Some of you know John and Karen Miller in this congregation, and they taught me that back in junior high. And hopefully, I'm sure John's watching on Zoom today. Thank you for that, John. We can all see each other as being all okay in this moment. The inherent worth of dignity of every person. To me, that's what that's about. We're all okay now. But it's not perfectionism to say that it's important that each of us do the work to improve and get better. You look around our community and our world, we can do better. We can do better. And we need to do better. But you can see this tension between grace, which requires nothing of us, and self-critique, which the very foundation and core of it is accountability. Now, some of you may, so they're kind of on the opposite ends of a spectrum, and some of you may wonder, okay, and I kind of wonder this too. So, okay, where does forgiveness come into this picture? Where does forgiveness fit in this? And I think forgiveness actually has a lot in common with the self-critique model, because to be forgiven, it implies you've got to be accountable. You got to admit that you made a mistake and you ask for forgiveness. That's accountability. It doesn't work very well if you've ever tried to forgive somebody before they've asked for forgiveness. Like, oh, I forgive you for being this way. I don't know, what was that way? What do you mean? That usually doesn't work out well. So I think that's where forgiveness lies, actually very close to self-critique. There's an interesting movie called Women Talking. And I don't know how many of you have seen it, but it's a movie about a group of Amish women talking about how they can prevent abuse, future abuse, by the men and the boys in their community. And in that movie, one of the women says, forgiveness can sometimes be confused with permission. And that might be true, but I think it's even more true if you substitute the word grace for forgiveness. Grace can sometimes be confused with permission. Because with grace, there's no expectation of change. Where's the incentive or the motivation to change or improve? It's not there with grace. I just will close with what to me is one of the most powerful examples of the difference between forgiveness and grace in my lifetime. And that was the dilemma really faced by the Black majority party, which had taken control in South Africa after nearly 80 years of white apartheid. Their dilemma was, what do we do with all these white perpetrators? Do we expel them all from our country? Do we take revenge? Do we kill them, imprison them? Do we give them blanket grace and say, those were different times, this is a new time, we start anew? They did none of those things. They took none of those options. They took the path of restorative justice and set up Truth and Reconciliation Committee, which held forums all over the country of South Africa, from the big cities to the smallest villages. And if a white perpetrator wanted the opportunity to seek amnesty, they had to go back to the community where they had done wrong. And at these forums, the victims were given a chance to speak. The perpetrators were given the opportunity to own up to their wrongs and the terrible deeds they had done. And only then could they apply for amnesty. That process met the needs of the victims, the perpetrators, and the nation as a whole. It wasn't grace. It was a process of accountability and forgiveness, ultimately, or amnesty. So, in conclusion, I guess I would think grace is good. Does self-critique offer a path for more growth and progress? Are the two mutually exclusive or contradictory, or is it possible we can embrace both of them? What do you think?